If it sounds like I'm wittering, it's just so that everybody knows when you come in whether or not your sound is working. So what you should be able to see in front of you is you should see 4 people. We're all from working within the teaching partnership. We're all from that region. So Omar Mohammed is a second year University of Birmingham student, and he is doing the tech for us today. Jane is also here. Jane is a student who has just completed her first placement, and Jane is going to share her thoughts about virtual supervision later on today. And Zoe, obviously everybody knows Zoe Yeomans as the teaching partnership. I don't know what your full title is, Zoe.
I am a practice lead consultant social worker for the teaching partnership. I'm one of 3. So I cover the South region, so I can see a few names that I know. Donna Marie is always around. Hi, Donna Marie. Hello, everyone. I'm Zoe Yeomans. Like I said briefly a few minutes ago, I'm a consultant social worker for the West Midlands Teaching Partnership. If we go, what I'm doing at the moment as well is scrolling through the slides myself so that I can remember what comes next, because I'm awful at that. So we have got... we are one of 23 accredited social work teaching partnerships. We've had a bit of discussion this morning as to whether we might be the biggest in the country, but not 100% sure, so I won't take that mantle yet. So the teaching partnership looks at higher education institutes and local authorities across the West Midlands. So you can see a little bit about us there on the screen now. If you pop over to the next slide for me, Siobhan. Our vision really, like it says there, is to work on joining in a research-led, evidence-based way HEIs and local authorities to basically improve the quality of social work education and continued professional development. So we're very big. We split into 3 sub-regions to do that. So the next slide is basically just an overview of these webinars that the West Midlands Teaching Partnership have commissioned Siobhan to develop. They came about right at the beginning of me picking up this role, in that noticing the significant impact that COVID-19 was having on student placements overall. And we realised that the best way to support students is to support the people who are directly supporting the students, which is all of you, practice educators. So we're basically delivering the 3 sessions, and this is the second one. The first one was on student learning, and it's available on the West Midlands YouTube channel. And this one will be as well. And we do send slides out afterwards, as well as certificates. So I think there were a couple of questions about that. If you go on to the next slide, Siobhan, that is a list of where you can find us basically. So we're all over the place. We like to reach as many people as possible. So please check us out on the YouTube channel, Facebook, Twitter, everything like that for more events. And we can hopefully find more ways to support you as a teaching partnership, as well as how we're doing with Siobhan today. So I'll hand over to you, Siobhan, and you can start this session on supervision in a virtual/remote world, because we're noticing that virtual sometimes makes people think it's not real, and actually it's very real. It's just we're in a remote world now. So there's a lot of language out there, so whatever works for you, but essentially this is the best way to support the people with supervision in whatever way we're doing that. Okay, so over to you, Siobhan.
Okay, thanks very much, Zoe. So I'm just going to ask if everybody else can put themselves on mute whilst I'm doing the presentation. But if anybody has a burning thing they need to say, or a question or something you need to let me know, then just switch on your mic, obviously, and tell me. But it's always very strange, isn't it, in this remote world, that I'm just sitting talking at a computer screen. So we've got, I think, 150 people in the room now, or something like that. I can't see anybody. It feels very strange doing it in this remote world. What we've tried to do is, and for those of you who attended last time, we've worked on the feedback that you've sent. What we've tried to do is make sure that there's lots of content in this hour and a half, but that we're also trying to make it interactive, and that is slightly more difficult. So one of the things that we've talked about is keep the Q&A for technical questions. But if you have any questions about the things that I'm talking about, or about aspects of the teaching partnership or anything, if you put those into the chat, Zoe's going to monitor the chat. If there's a very specific question that needs answering there and then, Zoe will ask it and we'll go through it. But otherwise, what we're going to try and do, if we don't get time at the end for a question and answer conversation, then we're going to collate the questions and we'll do a frequently asked questions document that we can send out to everybody that's attended the webinars. So today we're going to be looking at, you know, that phrase, as Zoe said, is it supervision in a virtual world or is it supervision in a remote world? We talked in the first webinar about the way that the word virtual, people think, well, is that therefore not happening? Social work is still happening. Supervision is still happening. It's just taking place in a different way. So the 3 webinars that Zoe talked about, we did the learning webinar, which is now available on the YouTube channel. We're doing today, looking at supervision, and next time we'll be looking at assessment. But actually, the learning and assessment come together in supervision. In many ways, supervision is what ties together the learning aspect of being a practice educator and the assessment aspect, because we help students to learn, but we also assess them in the context of supervision. So supervision is really important, but it's important not just for students, it's important for newly qualified workers, it's important for practitioners, it's important for people who've been qualified 30 years like I have. Supervision is something that we need throughout our social work career, and that's really important. So it doesn't matter where we are on our social work journey, we all need good quality, emotionally supportive, reflective supervision. And maybe now we need that more than ever before, because of the new ways of working, because of the challenges of working as a social worker in a global pandemic. So I'm going to ask you to just take a little bit of time for yourself, wherever you're sitting now, if you're at your kitchen table or sat on your bed, wherever you are, to reflect on your own supervision history. Because research tells us that the most significant impact on the supervision that you provide to others is the supervision that you receive and have received in the past. And that's why, you know, as I've said, supervision matters for all of us. So it's important to really reflect on your own experiences of supervision. If we had more time together, I'd be asking you to look at what has made supervision in the past and maybe even in the present for you, what's made supervision a positive experience, and what has made supervision a less positive experience for you. And in many ways, what you can then look at is how do you build on the positives and how do you minimize the negatives. But it's also really important to recognize that what's positive for one person might not be positive for another person. Everybody's experiences of supervision and what everybody likes in terms of supervision style is actually quite unique, and that's a really important thing to think about. So I just want you to take just that little bit of time before we start to think about your own supervision. Do you get good supervision at the moment? How do you feel about the supervision that you're being provided with? And I think supervision for practice educators is so important, and sometimes I think it's not always as good as we would perhaps like it to be. So maybe have a think about that. You may not want to talk about it in the chat, but maybe just have a think about it for yourself. In the first webinar, I introduced the framework that I use for pretty much everything in social work around the what, why and how framework. So I use this for everything. And I introduced that into the last webinar. So we talked about how, for example, I would encourage students, if they're going to see a service user or to work with a family, to think about what's happening for this person, why has this situation come about, how can I work with them to bring about improved outcomes. I would like students to be able to answer those 3 key questions. I'd like to structure aspects of our discussions around those. I use it a lot. I use it to think about my work with students. So what are the students' learning needs? Why are those important? How will I help the student learn those? And how will I assess whether they've learned them? So I use this what, why, how framework in everything that I do. And we talked about this last time. But the thing that you hear a lot of conversation about in social work at the moment is the golden thread of supervision. And I suppose I wanted to link this golden thread back into the what, why, how framework that we talked about last time. So there's been a lot of research recently into social work, predominantly in child protection. If I'm being honest with you, most of the research is in children and family social work. So Wilkins et al. Has done loads of research based at the University of Cardiff, done loads and loads of research. And for those of you who are doing your practice educator qualifications, it's worth looking at that research to use in your assignments, because there's such a lot of really good quality research. And in one of their research papers, 2018 references there, they had listened to audio recordings of a lot of supervision sessions in one particular London authority, this particular research was. And they were really listening in to try and decide whether they thought that the supervision was practice focused. And they considered 3 key questions in understanding or in concluding whether they thought the supervision was practice focused. The first one was, do we know what the social worker is going to do in the next home visit or in the next few visits? Do we understand why the social worker is going to do these things and how they're going to do them? And so finally, they looked at, has this discussion helped the social worker to think more carefully about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and why they're going to do it? So for me, I think that demonstrates the practice basis of that what, why, and how framework. When we bring that into supervision, it enables us to keep supervision practice focused. And that's, I suppose, in a way, I started to think about this golden thread of supervision. So in preparing for the webinar this morning and looking at what should we cover and what content should we have in here, you know, how do you cover supervision in just over an hour? That kind of question is huge. So looking at how are we going to cover this? How are we going to structure it? In some ways, I was thinking, well, shall we look at what is supervision? Why is it important? How do we do it? But actually, that still didn't sit fully comfortably with me. And I decided I really, really wanted to use this golden thread of supervision. And what came to me was that, to me, the golden thread of supervision, whilst yes, it is based around that what, why, and how, is actually about the P's, the letter P. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at, I suppose, in a way, the letter P as the golden thread within supervision. So the subtitle, if you like, for today is Supervision, All the P's. I did think, well, we're in the midst of a pandemic, so, you know, why not use the P to think about supervision? So I'm going to ask you, what words beginning with P do you associate with supervision? And I want you to put those into the chat, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do that now, and you can carry on doing that through the next couple of slides. What words that begin with the letter P do you think relate to supervision? And then what we'll do is Zoe's going to keep an eye on that, and we're going to review it at the end and look at what P words did you come up with that weren't included in the presentation. As I talk through the presentation, for yourselves, I want you to write down your own P words and tick them off as I do them. So it might give us a little bit of interactivity going through the session. So as I say a word beginning with P, if you had that on your list, fabulous. How many P words have you got? If I just give you a moment or two, think about, do you have 3 words beginning with P? Do you have 6 words beginning with P? Have you got 10 words beginning with P? You know, all of these models that we use quite a lot, there's the 10C model of reflection, there's the 4F model of reflection. There's lots of models that hang on use of repeated letters, so 10 Cs. There's in resilience, there's the 5 Cs of resilience model. There's loads of models that use a number of words beginning with the same letter. So how many P's in supervision? And that was what I sat when I was preparing the session today, the presentation, the PowerPoint. See all these words that are coming out already that begin with P. When I was preparing it, I wrote down all the words I could think of to do with supervision that began with P. And on a final slide, I'll tell you how many P words I came up with. I'm not going to cover all of them in the presentation because we've only got an hour. But that's what I want you to think about, is what words come to your mind. I still want us, by the end of this session, for you to feel that you've been able to reflect on the what, the why, and the how of supervision in our new remote world. That's, I suppose, what I want us to still get at the end. But we're going to use the P as the golden thread of today's presentation about supervision. keep putting in the words beginning with P as they come to you. Keep popping those in the chat. I can see Zoe busy writing them down. So the first word I'm going to use beginning with P is purpose. And for me, I said to you in the last webinar that I've worked with 5 students during this, well, from the beginning of the pandemic. Jane is one of those students, and you're going to hear from her later. And it's been a real experience because their placements were called virtual placements. Jane's was very much not a virtual placement, I think almost from day one, but that was the way we set about working together. The placements finished on Friday. So I'm hoping Jane will feel free to say whatever she wants to say, because her report has already been handed in. So that means that we've got that whole element there of us sharing our thoughts later on today. But for me, reflecting back on the experience of working with the 5 students in a very new way of being a practice educator, I think there's been perhaps 2 key learning points. I'm going to share one of those with you later. The other key learning point, I think, has been the need for clarity about the purpose of supervision. It's perhaps been one of my most significant learning points, is what is supervision all about and why do we do it? Because that then impacts on how the student uses it. And I think I've perhaps not been as clear on purpose as I could have been on the purpose of supervision. And that's reminded me, as I've reflected back as the placements have progressed, it's really reminded me of Simon Sinek's golden circle. So I've talked about the what, why, how framework for a long time, and I describe it as a framework, and I usually use it as directional arrows. But Simon Sinek places the why in the middle of what he calls the golden circle. So he says the why sits in the middle of the how and the what. He's a leadership. He's described as a guru. He's someone who writes a lot about leadership. His book, there's a global bestseller. It's called Start With Why, or Find Your Why. He's written loads of books about the importance of why. We know about the importance of why in social work, don't we? But he says everybody knows, every organisation, every company, he says, knows what they do, but they don't all know why they do it. Now, I would say, I think social workers know why we do things, and that's our golden circle. In my view, good social work practice has why at the very start. We understand why we are doing something. Students need to know why are they doing something. It's really important that social work, good social work, has why at both the start and at the heart. I don't think we need to find our why, as Simon Sinek says. I think we know our why, but I do think sometimes we forget about our why and we have to revisit it. So for me, that reflection on the purpose of supervision is almost about, I lost the why. I lost the why of supervision. I don't think I was clear enough, perhaps with students, about why supervision happens. What is it and why do we do it? So it's prompted me to revisit, I think, what everybody here will know. If you've ever done any kind of practice educator training or supervision training, you will have looked at the functions of supervision. So Toni Morrison really wrote about the 4 functions, but lots of other people have written about the functions in different ways. And I've tried to pull together a lot of that writing into this grid here. I suppose what I'm looking at is, as well as the function, I've started in this grid by looking at the why of supervision. So why do we have supervision? Now, this might be something you could reflect on for yourself, but also for the student. So if you look at the first thing up there, is the why of supervision is because it's about ensuring competent, accountable practice. And that's met through the function of supervision, which Toni Morrison referred to as the managerial function. Other writers talk about it as accountability, administrative, normative function. So then out of that, we could look at, well, what should the student experience with us then? The student should experience space to discuss their practice, to reach decisions with support, a kind of level of shared decision making, clearly agreed accountability. That's the top, the sort of the function, the managerial function. But then what about the developmental function? Now that should sit there all of the time, because one of the objectives of supervision is to encourage continuing professional development. I think for lots of people that doesn't always happen. That kind of developmental bit of supervision isn't always there, but students should definitely experience the opportunity for reflective discussion to help them to learn and develop. We also offer supervision to provide personalised support to people, which is met through the function of the supportive function. So the student should experience personal support with the challenges of the role. There should be space for them to discuss the emotional context of their practice. But it is important to recognise that supervision isn't a counselling session. So we do have to, as practice educators, look at how do we maintain the boundaries there and get the balance of support without tipping towards counselling. And then the final objective of supervision is to really engage the practitioner with the organisation. And this is the function that, if you look at supervision policies, I know that we've got people here from loads of different local authorities across the region, but if you look at your local authority or your organisation's supervision policy, I can pretty much guarantee that they will talk about the managerial, developmental and supportive function, whether they use that exact wording or not. But a lot of them don't talk about the mediation function. The mediation function is sometimes referred to as the negotiation function. It's partly the role of how does a supervisor mediate between the organisation and the employee, I suppose. As a practice educator, I think this is one of the most important functions, that we can mediate between what the students learn in university and what actually happens in practice, and how can we help them to sometimes put those things together, mediate that practice and academic role of a social worker. How do we help them to mediate that? So that's just to remind us of the functions, if you like, of supervision. But what I think often workers experience is more like this. A supervisor starting off with, how are you feeling? Are you okay? And then in their head ticking off, okay, I've done the supportive function. Later on in the session, they might ask, have you done any training? Is there any training you want to go on? And then they tick off in their head, I've done the developmental function. Just to be clear, you cannot meet a function of supervision through a single question. It's about the whole of supervision should feel developmental, should feel supportive, and there should be aspects of the managerial function. What I would say as a practice educator, in my view, I don't think we can meet all four of those functions in each single supervision session. So I just think it's too much. And what I tend to do is try and think about the student needs all of those things. So the final column there, what the student should experience if those functions are in place, I look at those functions. Are they experiencing those things? Where are they getting them from? They may not get them all from a single session. They might get some of this from a group session, or they might get some of this from an informal supervision, or some from supervision with their on-site supervisor. So I look at making sure the student has all of those functions, but not necessarily in one single session. So we're going to look at the impact of doing this virtually. I do appreciate Zoe's thought earlier about the language, but this was the language we used when we set the webinars up. So how do we do this when we're not with the person, if you like? It looks like Jane lost and has come back on. I'm hoping we can reconnect again with Jane. But I'm going to ask, at this point, there's a poll. Omar is going to put a poll up. I'm going to ask you to think about how you're finding doing supervision in this new way of working. So it depends what device you're watching on. I'm hoping most people are able to see it, but there's a poll that's just come up that you can vote on. And it asks you, how are you finding virtual supervision? And the options you've got are, you could say, well, it's better than face-to-face. It's okay. I'm finding it really hard. Or I'm still doing supervision face-to-face, because I know there are still some teams where supervision is still happening face-to-face. So we've got an option here for you to answer. At the moment, we're at the point of about 70 people, about half of the people here, just over half, have answered the poll. I'm going to leave it there for a little while so that you can continue to answer that poll if you like. It helps us to capture what people are thinking in terms of how supervision is going in the new way of working, virtually or remote or whatever. So at the moment, we have 114, 115, it's going up all the time, people have answered the poll. 74% of people, so a huge majority, are saying it's okay. 16% of people are finding it really hard. 6% of people are still doing supervision face-to-face, and only 4% of people think that supervision is better now than face-to-face. So that's a huge kind of, we're getting on with it okay. It's not perfect. And I think that's a feeling that many of us perhaps would have. So that's what we've captured there on the poll. We'll end that polling now, but the results will be there for you to see. So, and I think it's also helpful with these polls to help us all to keep active within the webinar, but also it gives some information to the teaching partnership about how things are going for practice educators, and it gives us a bit of a view of what's happening for people. So I think of it as, I always think of a student placement as a journey, and I've used that analogy for many years. And I know lots of you will have done if you've done training with me, I've talked about the journey a lot. So in terms of the journey, I think of supervision as the passport to the student's journey. So within the whole journey analogy, for me, supervision is about the passport. And there's another P for us. The reason that I think of supervision as the passport is you can't really go on a journey without it. You can do a journey without a passport, but you don't get to go very far. You don't get to experience new cultures, new climates, different kinds of food. You need a passport to do that. It's like social work. You can't really do social work without supervision. You don't go very far without supervision. So I use supervision as a passport analogy. And these are some of the reasons that I use the passport analogy for supervision. Firstly, uniqueness. Just as a passport is unique, my view is that supervision should be uniquely tailored. I would like to think, I would hope that every student I work with has a different experience of supervision with me, because I try and tailor it to their learning style, their learning needs. You could think about passport origins, or sometimes people have a dual passport. Passports talk about our identity, don't they? And I think it's really important for us to think about how do we address aspects of culture and identity within supervision, especially where there's aspects of diversity between supervisor and student. Think about passport stamps. I know probably Omar is too young to remember these days, but in the olden days, Omar, when you had a passport, you used to go traveling to places and they'd stamp it. That'd be like, you've visited this place. You used to get stamps. You don't get them now. It's really sad. I sometimes ask, can I have it stamped? And they're like, no, we don't stamp. Stamps were lovely when you used to collect stamps on your passport. And for me, it's like, that's almost like, where does a student get their supervision from? They don't have to get everything from just you as the practice educator. Maybe if a student has a particular learning need about, I don't know, carers assessments, and there's someone on the team that's really good at carers assessments, then maybe they do some supervision with that person, learning about carers assessments and some informal discussions. They can get their passport stamped there. They can have their passport stamped by the team manager who does a bit of supervision with them about their record keeping, for example. Let's try and enable students to use all of the available opportunities for supervision, group, individual supervision, and so on. Think about the worth of a passport. If you lose it, think how much it costs. It's huge cost. And I kind of question sometimes whether or not are we all recognizing the worth of supervision, I suppose. Think about the state of your passport. When a passport first comes and it's new, it's very inflexible, it doesn't move. But when you've had it for years, it's a bit tatty around the edges, and you kind of get, it's a bit like that with supervision. When someone's new to supervision, they've never experienced it before, they might not know quite how they want to use it or how to use it. It's a bit inflexible at times for them. Think about visas and the additional documentation. You know, I would ask myself, is the student arriving for supervision with all the necessary documentation, or do they look like one of those travellers that's arrived and can't find the bits of paper and can't find the passport and can't find, do they arrive prepared and ready to travel? And then I want you to think about passport photos. Now, this is something that I do quite a lot, but I'm going to ask you in your own mind's eye now to think about your passport photograph. What does it look like? Are you proud of your passport photo? I've never met anybody who blows up their passport photo and sticks it up on the wall in the front room, because there's so many rules about how you can look and what you can do, and you can't do this and you can't do that. It limits us. It limits who we are and how we can express ourselves. So, and supervision might be doing that sometimes. It might be limiting. But I looked at, I went on Google Images one time and put in Google Images, bad passport photo, to see what would come up, because I thought, oh, it might be funny on a PowerPoint slide, look to put up a bad passport photo. But actually what you get is not, you don't get images of bad passport photos. What you get is advice on how to take the right kind of passport photo. And this is the image that jumped out at me when I did this Google image search on passport photos. the image that jumped out at me comes from the Algerian embassy. You wouldn't think of that. That's why I've had to write it down there to remind me. That's where it comes from. It's the passport photo advice from the Algerian embassy. Jumped out at me straight away, this image. It says, you must not have your mouth covered by your hands, you must not have your eyes closed, and you must not have an unnatural facial expression or crying. And you look at that, and to me, that's almost like a student placement, the emotions of going through a student placement. It could almost be, it's not quite there, but it could almost be as well, see no evil, speak no evil, hear no evil. So there's almost that bit then as well about openness within supervision, a whole range of things that come out when I look at that image. And one of the things, if we think about the functions of supervision, if we think about what we're going to hear later from Jane as well, I think is about the importance of enabling space for discussion about the emotional context of practice in supervision. Supervision must provide a safe space to consider the emotional context of practice and to develop through, you know, getting that kind of balance, maintaining boundaries. It's difficult, it's challenging for us as practice educators, but it's vital to provide emotional support for students. But it's also important for your own supervision. So I'm going to ask you now to think about the supervision that you receive, because as I said to you, that's what impacts on the supervision you provide. And I want you to think about how emotionally supportive supervision feels for you. And there's another poll that's going to pop up here. This is, what I want you to remember is this is entirely anonymous. When you answer this poll, it is an entirely anonymous poll. Nobody knows what you're saying. So there should be a poll coming up, Omar, that's about how emotionally supportive supervision is at this point. I think it's coming up now. So again, if you're watching on different devices, whether or not you can see this, but it says here, do you feel that you get space to discuss the emotional context of your work in supervision? So this is your own supervision. Remember, nobody can see this. It's totally anonymous. All we know is how many people have voted. We don't know who voted what. And the options you've got are, there's lots of space to discuss the emotional context. There's some space, or there's no space. Now, all the research about supervision, so there's research from BASWA, there's research from Community Care that did a whole a very large project about supervision. All of the research that's asked people, asked social workers, how emotionally supportive is supervision, says that actually people don't feel always that supervision is as emotionally supportive as it could be. And I think at the moment, with the pandemic, with the impact of the pandemic, with the impact of the emotions of that kind of work, it's really important, and it's one of the reasons we wanted to ask this. So we've had about 120 people voting so far, and what we've got is that 66% of people feel that there's some space to talk about the emotional context, which is, you know, it's really good to hear that there's some space. 21% of people feel there is no space, and only 13% of people feel that there's lots of space. It's good to hear that 66% of people think that there's some space. It would be great if that was the number of lots of space, wouldn't it? But it is good that people feel there's some space to talk about the emotional context of supervision, because it's very important. I think it's particularly important for students, and we'll perhaps come back to this point later. But this is about passport photos. So emotions doesn't begin with a P, but passport photos do, and that's where we're talking about the emotional context of supervision. The next word beginning with P that I want to talk about is place. And this is something that over the years of being, it's 27 years ago that I worked with the first student I worked with as an on-site supervisor. And I can remember every time I've worked with students, one of the things I've really put quite a bit of thought into is, where will we do supervision? How do we get a private space for supervision? And some offices, that's really challenging. And you know, how do you get a private space for supervision? And it's not always been fully appropriate. It's not always been as good as it could be, but I've always made sure that there's been a private space for us to get together for supervision. But this is definitely changing, isn't it? Where we do supervision is changing really significantly. when Jane talks to you later about supervision, I think every time that Jane and I have done supervision, it's been in a different place. I think I've seen the whole of your house, Jane. I've been around every room in the house almost. I feel like we do it in different places each time, which is lovely. But it's that bit about we're in a different place every time we do it. And I do think that that has had an impact on aspects of boundaries. And I want to talk about the pedagogy P's. I think lots of you will be familiar with this, but to me, this links in to place. It's not always used to link into place. The pedagogy P's are about us as people. The pedagogy P's are that we all have 3 P's. In social pedagogy, they talk about 3 P's. I add in a 4th P. I sometimes add in a 5th P, but for today, we're going to talk about the 4 P's that each of us have. So the way the P's are discussed in social pedagogy is that each of us has these P's to us. So we have a private persona, if you like. We could use the other P. We have a private persona. That's the P that nobody else will ever see except our most intimate private partner in life. That P that only our private partner knows. We all have a personal P. That's the P outside of work. That covers who we are outside of work. You know, I'm a mom, I'm a daughter, it's the who we are outside of work. It's the what kind of things we like to do. It's the what kind of things we get up to. That's our personal P. Then there's our professional P, and I'm sitting here now in my professional persona in my work. It's my working time, and this is my professional P. So we sit in our different P's at different times. So the professional P is our P at work. And increasingly, most people nowadays have a public P. Now, I would say the public P is maybe the P on social media. So who are you on social media? Are students using Facebook and Twitter? And what's your public face? How are you seen? What's your public persona? So we have these 4 P's about us. We don't talk about these enough in social work, I think, because there's so many ways of using them. I talk about the P's in terms of relationship building with service users. They're really good to think about building of boundaries. I think we referred to them briefly in the first webinar. So the P's can be really helpful to think about boundaries, lots of different things. But for me, one of the things I've thought about a lot more during working in the pandemic is that I think the P's are not just about who we are, but they're also about where we are. Because are we working with people in a public space, you know, or is it private? Are we in a professional space? Are we bringing professional activities into our personal spaces? I very much feel that we are doing that now. You know, I'm sitting at my kitchen table doing a professional piece of work. You know, we're bringing professional activities into personal or sometimes even private spaces. You know I've been doing supervision with some students where they're sitting on their bed, and for me, I'm thinking, you know, how are we going to make sure that you're also having good sleep at night when we're talking about challenging issues? And it's those sorts of things I think we really need to spend time thinking about place and thinking about boundaries. I have met students that I've been working with. I've met their children. I would have never have met their children if we were working in the old way of working. I've met Jane's dog. I would have never have met Milo, Jane's dog, who pops up occasionally into supervision. I would have never have met Milo if we'd have been working in the way we used to work. So some of the boundaries are blurring a little bit around where we do things, and how do we then maintain this is still a professional activity even though we're doing it in a personal space. How do we maintain that, and an awareness of that is something I think we need to think about. So there's some more P's. Another P that I talked about last time, and Gavin, who joined us last time if you were here, talked about one of the postcards that he'd chosen. For me, I use postcards. It's a P. I use postcards to open up supervision. I found it's a really good way of opening up supervision in a way that's reflective and emotionally supportive. So I still start the question of supervision. The opening question is, how are things? How are you feeling? But I find what you get is quite a stilted, I'm really busy, or I'm a bit stressed, or I'm okay, or you don't really get into any depth. So I still start with that, but then we'll say, okay, let's go into, we build the agenda, and then we look into the postcard. And the student shares with me the postcard that they've chosen to represent where they are on their journey. They bring that postcard with them to the beginning of supervision. in this virtual world, I've had to think about, well, shall I just do that virtually? Shall I just say bring any picture? But what I decided to do was still use, I like the physicality of things like prompt cards and postcards, all beginning with P's. I like the physical nature of using those and keeping connected with those. It doesn't work for everybody, and I'm always open to, you know, if it's not worked after a couple of times, we don't do it again, it's fine. But I found that physical postcards are still better. So I sent the students a pack of postcards, and this is the picture that Jane sent me from her. In fact, I think you can see the colour of the wall. It's probably the room you're sitting in now, Jane. I don't know. You're probably looking at this as we speak. But Jane put the postcards that she chose each week in front of her, and she sent me this picture of this is her placement journey. And I think it can be really helpful to have that physical connection for students to one another, to a thing, to something. It can be helpful. And I think what's really useful about postcards is that different people see different things in the images. So talking about postcards can help the student to recognise why maybe two social workers see the same situation in a different way, because we see things differently. So I do think it's important how we use these postcards. It's not just about the student saying, here's my postcard, and you saying, okay, great. We need to have a conversation about this postcard. This conversation, I think, sets the tone for a reflective conversation within supervision, and it helps us to see that there's different perspectives on the same scenario and so on. So this picture of the postcard that I've put up here, some of you may have heard this because I've told this story before, but it's an important story and I do want to share it with you. Before I had a set of postcards, you don't have to have a particular set of postcards, you could just have any postcards. The set is because people asked me to put one together, but I just used to use my own. Wherever I went, I'd collect a postcard. And I used to spend ages in shops thinking, I'll choose this postcard because it will mean this, I'll choose this postcard because it will mean that. And then what I realised was, no one ever chose the postcard to represent what I thought it meant. So I just used to collect a whole range of different postcards. And there was one time I went to, I remember it quite vividly, I went to a social work conference in Iceland. Now we don't do that very often, so obviously it stayed in my mind. And I picked up a set of postcards from a charity shop, and they were just like in a pack. And when I got home, I unpacked them and this postcard was there. And I remember looking at it thinking, am I going to be able to use that? Should I use that? What should I do with that? And I decided to keep it, but I kept it not in my student box, because I had a student box of postcards that I would give to students, but I had a training box and I put it in my training box. And whenever I went out to do training, I used them in lots of different ways. And probably 2 times a week, maybe 3 times a week, I would lay out all the postcards. This postcard was tatty when I got it, and it got more and more tatty, obviously, because I was laying it out. I laid this postcard out for 3 years. And in activities, I would say to people, choose a postcard that represents where you are now, and then choose another one that represents where you want to be, and then we'll talk about them. And this postcard was laid out 2 or 3 times a week for 3 years, and nobody ever picked this postcard. It was the only postcard, I think, that had never been picked in the set. And then one day I was at a really big conference, and I was just doing a very quick activity. And the activity included choose a postcard where you are, where you want to be in 6 months, and then we'll take them back to tables and have a conversation about them. It was like an opener. And I saw somebody pick up this postcard. You should have seen me trying to run over and listen into what she was going to say, because it was the only time this postcard had ever been picked. And this is what the person said when she shared the postcard. She turned it over and I saw the other person look at it I could see the surprise on her face. But this person said, I'm a newly qualified social worker and I've chosen this postcard to represent where I am now. She said, I feel like when I was a student, I was really protected. As a student, she said, in fact, I would describe my practice educator, and this is why I'm telling you this story in this session. She said, in fact, I would describe my practice educator as like a condom. She was so protective of me. She kept me really safe and protected in my practice. She said, and in fact, it was like being double bagged because I had an on-site supervisor as well. So I just felt really safe and protected as a student. She said, when I started my ASYE, I was told that I would be given a protected caseload. She said, what I think is a protected caseload and what my manager thinks is a protected caseload are probably 2 entirely different things. We might as well be speaking to each other in a foreign language, because on the back of this postcard, it's all written in a foreign language. And she said, and that's how I feel. She said, I feel like now that I'm qualified, I feel like the condom's burst and I could be spreading all kinds of viruses. I don't feel safe in my practice anymore. And then she talked about where she wanted to be and the other postcard. And then the other person sat with her, shared back what she saw in the postcard, because this is what's important, is the sharing of what you see in the postcard and how you might see it differently. So the other person said to her, when you turn that postcard over, I remember thinking, I've never seen a green condom with legs. What on earth am I going to say about this postcard? She said, but now you've told me why you picked it, it makes total sense to me, and I can completely see why that postcard spoke to you around the things you were saying. She said, but this is what I think. She said, you might feel a little bit green, a little bit naive in your practice, but to me, she said, it sounds like your practice is really safe. She said, maybe you feel like this is the first time you're standing on your own 2 feet, and perhaps on reflection, after you've shared with me, maybe your practice educator was too overprotective towards the end of your training to enable you to be ready for this. She said, but actually, this is exactly what she said. She said, excuse my language. She said, but I don't like social workers that are too cocky about their practice. They get a bit cocksure of themselves. And she said, I just don't like that. I like professional humility. And what you've just shown is that you have professional humility. You know what you don't know, and you know who to go and ask for help. Now, what you can see in that is the same postcard seen and interpreted in very different ways. So the newly qualified social worker talked about how she didn't feel safe where she was in a practice, but the person who was talking to her said, I've been a practice educator for years and this is how I see it, enabled her to see that actually where she was a very safe space to be. So it helps the person to see their own position in a different way. And there's the phrase that's just come up on the screen for you now is an old Buddhist phrase. We see things not as they are, but we see things as we are. So a sharing of that postcard at the beginning helps the student to develop self-awareness, which is such an important aspect of social work. It's that self, that use of self, that is so important and in many ways difficult to learn as a student. So this is some feedback from a student, not from this round of placements, but from a couple of placements ago. The student said, I found choosing a weekly postcard helped me to reflect, honestly. It helped me to tune into and to prepare for supervision. I've been able to express my feelings and my emotions through a wide range of images. For me, looking at pictures, I felt they were able to represent my feelings and my learning at that point in the journey, perhaps more than I could in words. In addition, the postcards gave me a platform from which to discuss any issues, and by sharing the postcards at the start of supervision, I felt Siobhan was able to prompt discussion about how I was feeling, and in some circumstances helped me to see things differently. Consistently, I get really positive feedback about the use of postcards. What I'd say to you is, it's a good way of doing it. You don't have to have a set of postcards. You could adapt it. You could say to people, bring a picture. I do feel that it comes from a different place. I think sometimes people go in Google Images and put feeling stressed and just get the picture that comes up. So it comes from a different place then than if you've given them things. But maybe you could send them some pictures to choose from, or maybe another way of doing it is, rather than bring in a postcard, I use a postcard because of the journey analogy, but I know some supervisors who do this for their team. I know one supervisor who has a box full of, I can only describe it as stuff, and the person picks something from that box and brings it into supervision to say how they're feeling. It started off as lots of different bits of material, so they'd come in with sandpaper, but it's expanded into just stuff really, so people bring an item in and you could adapt it. So I think we need an opener, and I like to use postcards as my opener. So that was another P. And now we're going to go into a double P, planning and preparation. This is so important, I think, in terms of supervision. We talked last time about the importance of reflection for action, and I do think that's important. I've been writing into learning agreements for a long time now that students should be given the same amount of time to prepare for supervision as they spend in supervision. So if we have an hour and a half supervision session, they should be given an hour and a half to prepare for that. Because I don't want the students to say I haven't had time to prepare, because then what's the point of supervision? We're not going to get from it what we need to get from it. So I get that written into learning agreements, and I think that's very important. All of us need to prepare for supervision, but students need that extra reflection for action. You know, the phrases that are up there now, poor preparation leads to poor performance is a very standard kind of phrase. I would say poor preparation leads to a poor placement. I do think we need a lot of planning and preparation. And to prepare for working with the students that I've recently completed working with on their virtual placement, I spent ages and ages planning. The planning didn't necessarily go particularly well, and I'll reflect on that later. But I'm going to hand over at this point to Jane, who is one of those students that I worked with on the virtual placement. And Jane's going to tell you a little bit about her perspective on the things we're talking about today.
Hi, yeah. So, like, I think when I first had supervision with Siobhan, and then after discussing it, I realised that supervision just became a revelation to me, really, because I've had lots of roles. I've had different jobs in the past prior to becoming a student social worker, and some of those roles have had well, supervision in them, but it wasn't supervision as I'd experienced it whilst on placement. So for example, I worked in a school as a teaching assistant, and supervision there was like once a year box ticking exercise. Was I doing the job I was supposed to be doing? Was I still able to keep my job? Was I meeting my manager's expectations? And it felt like there was a bit of a power struggle really going on in that, because I wasn't allowed to challenge. I wasn't allowed to bring ideas or discussions to the meeting. It was literally 5-10 minutes long at most. I couldn't ask questions in there. There was no room for CPD. There was no room for development. As far as they were concerned, I was at the top of my game in terms of where I was in my career. And I wasn't respected as a professional. I wasn't given any opportunity to challenge their ideas and decisions. And if I ever did, I'd get criticised for being emotional, or I'd get reprimanded for being emotional, and you know, sort of bringing emotion to a situation that I, you know, was upset about. So it just didn't happen. There was another role I had where I was a care support worker in residential for 2.5 years, and in that time I had one supervision session, and again, like working with really challenging children that were, you know, physically aggressive, and even after an incident of restraint or being, you know, physically attacked by one of the children, we never got supervision, we never got debriefed. It was just, you know, just carry on, keep it, you know, stiff upper lip and get on with the job. So coming to sort of student work, student social work, and having supervision with Siobhan was just revelationary. It was just a completely different experience to what I've ever had before. And I got it coming at me from all directions. I had 2 practice supervisors as well as Siobhan, and I think it meant that over the course of 60 days I've received more than 20 sessions of supervision in one format or another, which is quite extraordinary. And I didn't know what to expect that first session with Siobhan. I just expecting to just, you know, a box ticking exercise, you know, is everything going okay? How's it all going? So I didn't even sit somewhere private. I sat in the public office. There were about 3 other people around me, and I felt really awkward, but more awkward about getting up and moving and going, oh, I'm going to take this somewhere else. So I just sort of ploughed through and carried on with it. And yeah, it was quite incredible to think I was allowed to talk about my thoughts and feelings and my opinions, and have a proper in-depth discussion about how things were going. You know, working in the pandemic was quite difficult. The placement itself was difficult. We were supposed to be virtually placed, but as Siobhan said, you know, from the outstart of my placement, I hit the ground running. I was working in adult mental health, and from day one on placement, I was out on visits, which was, again, like, I wasn't even expecting that to happen. But then having supervision about it all, I didn't realise I'd be able to discuss it all and discuss what work I was doing, who I was doing it with. I wasn't able to discuss my supervisors. I didn't realise I could do any of that. So of course this very public first supervision session was quite something. And sort of as time went on, obviously I found a different room in the house, and as Siobhan said, she's seen every room in my house, I think, so far, but it's been more private. And using the postcards for me has been really useful. It gives you really good focus. For me, choosing a postcard, it was generally how was I feeling that week, and I'd sort of sift through the postcards, and whichever one spoke to me was the one I'd go with. It was a gut instinct for me to use that particular picture, because it was, yeah, that's how I feel right now. I didn't have to, you know, it wasn't a sift through them and talk about it at length. It was just like, yeah, that's exactly how I feel, and that's explained it for me more visually than being able to put it into words would be able to do. But, you know, just being able to challenge myself in supervision, being able to challenge my supervisors, being able to challenge Siobhan if I needed to, was just so useful. But also having the space to breathe and the space to reflect and the space to get emotional was just so valuable. I did cry several times, I think, not every week. There were times I didn't cry, but just being able to do that and have the emotion accepted was just incredible, because like before, like I've said, I was reprimanded for it. I was told off for bringing emotion into it, and I was classed as unprofessional for being upset about things that bothered me, and that bothered me more, really. I would say when I did cry in supervision, I was mortified, absolutely mortified. I didn't know what to do with myself. I don't think Siobhan knew what to do with me, and I was just like, what do I do now? Like, I've come across as really weak, I've come across as unprofessional, but to know then that actually I was supported, it was a safe space, it was somewhere just private to be able to just gather my thoughts and talk about what was bothering me, was just brilliant. It was just, supervision's really valuable. And yeah, so like I say, 60 supervision placement days and 20 supervision sessions. I've had various different styles. Like my practice supervisors would do it sort of face to face as well as virtually, and each session has been different, but they've all been really valuable, and it's all been such a good part of my placement. I have felt safe, I have felt supported. I got through my placement, and I think I passed all right. So having that support network of supervisors and Siobhan for supervision has just made it a lot easier, really, to go forward into the next placement.
Thank you, Jane. There's another P that I hadn't thought of, pass, because you did have, you know, it says very clearly on your report, doesn't it, pass? So there was a P I'd not thought of, actually. Thank you for that. I'm sorry I didn't introduce you properly. I had a terrible coughing fit. I didn't know where that came from, and had to go out. And I couldn't find my mute either, so it was a bit difficult. So I'm very sorry about that. But thank you. I could, even though I wasn't sitting here, I could hear everything, and that was really helpful. So I think, you know, Jane, that I've reflected on our supervisory relationship and what's happened. And we, Jane and I wrote a blog, which we're happy to send to Zoe as well too. We did a blog after the last webinar as a follow-up resource. I'm happy to send the blog to Zoe, but Jane and I did a blog together about the the tiers in supervision. So this image is my pivotal moment, if you like. I suppose I said to you there were two key learning points. One was about purpose, and for me this is the pivotal moment of all of this planning and preparation I've done about how will I do this, how will I do supervision with these students, what experiences will they have. I'd focused entirely on practical issues, and I realised afterwards I'd not really thought about emotions. And why hadn't I thought about emotions? Because pretty much every student I work with will cry at some point during supervision, and that's to be expected. As Jane said, she didn't cry in every session, and she didn't cry all the way through any session. You know, that would be a worry. But I think to cry occasionally in supervision, to me, is fine. And to me, it could be cathartic and it's helpful. And because I'm asking people, how does that make you feel? And that then connects different aspects of thinking and feeling. But what I've realised is doing this remotely, one thing I reflected on was, I think when we're doing it on screen, you're concentrating just on the person's face. So that I'm looking at the screen and all I can see is the student's face. And I've realised that when I'm in a room with them together, I'm not so focused just on their face. I'm seeing the whole body language or whatever. But I could see the tears coming from Jane before they came. And I went into another P. I went into a panic. What am I going to do? Because my usual strategy is of leaning down into my bag and pulling a tissue out and giving the student a tissue and just sitting with them and maybe going and making them a cup of tea if I needed to. I couldn't do any of that because we were doing this remotely. I couldn't say to Jane, do you want to go and make yourself a cup of tea? Because I didn't want Jane's family to see her crying. And there's whole, you know, all different things that go through your mind. And I just panicked completely. And then I think eventually we did work through it, didn't we, Jane? And everything was fine. And but it was that moment of me seeing the tears coming and thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this? So I suppose what I'd say is, if you've not done supervision remotely before, it is something just to think about. How are you going to deal with that when it happens? And the blog that we wrote on about it afterwards might help you to just put some thought into that. So Jane also said she's had 20 sessions in the 60 days, and we have talked about that a little bit. I wondered whether, because I was worried about these placements when they started, I think I planned to do more supervision than I normally would. And so the other P is plenty. I suppose it's how much is enough. It's that kind of thing. I personally base it around, I think students should experience 2 hours a week. And now I know each program will have different requirements. A lot of the programs say an hour and a half a week. The requirements for social workers, in our early career, there should be supervision weekly for the first 6 weeks when you're first appointed as a social worker, then fortnightly up to the 6-month point, and then from there on in monthly throughout our career. They're the requirements. I don't know how much is enough. I suppose it's something for us to reflect on. You need to think about it. You need to look at the programme requirements. I do wonder whether Jane had too much, but we've talked about, can there ever be too much supervision, and how would we manage that? Some of that supervision was group, some was individual. It was all very different, as Jane says. So I think we concluded that it was okay because there were lots of different opportunities, different supervision sessions. So we've talked a lot about supervision. I'm just wanting to mention, and there's a lot of words on this slide, I'm not going to read all of them out, but and you will get the slides later. But I wanted to think about peer group sessions and peer supervision, I suppose, and maybe introduce the word intervision into today's session. So intervision is a very specific way of working with a group. It focuses on the emotional context of practice. So some of the things that we were talking about, and Jane was talking about, how do we get the space, the safe space to share with our peers, rather than share, here's a piece of work I've done, what do you think I should do next, which is very often how peer sessions are used. Intervision is about a supportive exchange and challenge, but between professionals who are equal. So if you like supervision, if you go back to the Latin, it's often translated as being overseeing. Intervision is between seeing. So UK, intervision is used a lot in medicine and in counselling and therapy, but we don't use it very much in social work. There has been some early research about the use of intervision, particularly in practice learning and for practice educators, which has been seen as being very popular. So there's just a final poll we're going to use now, I think, that Omar's going to put up, and it's got 2 parts to this poll. So if you can see it when it pops up in a moment, you're first of all going to be asked, have you heard of intervision? So have you heard the word intervision? Yes, no, or not sure. And then the second part of the poll is, would you be interested in attending intervision sessions online if the teaching partnership offered them? So that would mean practice educators coming together with support and challenge to talk about issues around their practice education. So intervision it's a different form of peer group supervision. But that's what it is. So there is some, I think I've referenced it in the materials, there's a really interesting United Nations document about what intervision and supervision should mean, and it's a really useful piece if people wanted to go and look at that a little bit more. But what we're getting here is there's 110 people or so who voted, and we've got 91% of people who haven't heard of intervision, 4% have, and 5% are not sure. In terms of whether people are interested in attending intervision sessions, 87% of people say yes, 12% are not sure, and only 1% is no. So that's an interesting overview there of something that I wanted to mention when we're talking about supervision. I think the importance of peer group is really helpful, particularly with remote working, because it helps people to keep connected. And with Jane's placement, we did weekly group supervision and fortnightly individual supervision. That's the way I worked it with Jane. So one week Jane would see me twice, once individually and once in the group, and then the following week she'd just see me in the group. So peer sessions I think are really valuable, and that's why we wanted to ask about intervision. So we've now had 116 votes and things haven't changed very much in terms of the poll. Thank you very much for going with the poll. It's another P, of course, which is why we're also using the poll. So thank you very much for sharing the poll there. Another P that is really important, in terms of supervision is power. One of the most important P's really to think about is power. You know, as Jane said, I think I've passed. Jane has passed and is very clear, but I think there's still always this sense for students of have I, you know, there's a sense of this power dynamic that's really difficult. And it plays out within supervision. And Liz Beddoe, whose work I really like, on practice education, she did an A to Z of supervision, which is actually really good. You can get it off the Scopt box if people want to access it. It's just an A to Z of student supervision, and it's great. It's like a poster, goes through the A to Z. And her P, because I thought if I'm going to do the P's, let's look at the A to Z of supervision. Her P was power. And she says, in effective supervision, any power differentials between supervisors and supervisees, it's named and it's transparent. And a misuse of power, she says, sits behind much harmful supervision. So where supervision doesn't work, it's usually a misuse or a mislabeling, if you like, of power. I would suggest, I do this quite a lot with students, is think about power flows, think about the different types of power, how we can separate it out. And I think if you think about professional power, resource power, and the power to determine, make decisions or determine outcomes, if you think about that in relation to the student and the practice educator, and think about who holds professional power, it's largely the practice educator. If you think about who holds resource power, it's largely with the practice educator. And if you think about in the student's mind who holds the power to determine, it's with the practice educator. So whether or not you talk about it, it's a very big aspect in the student's mind, is the flow of power in a supervisory relationship. But what can be helpful for students to recognise is, actually, if you change this over to service user, student social worker, power is the same flow. Helping people understand power in the context of relationships is important. And I have done a webinar on the use of power and empowerment in social work, which you might find helpful to explore in terms of all of the different layers of power. So forms, levels, realms, spaces, sources, faces, dimensions, all of those things are about power, and they all relate to power in a supervisory relationship. And we can't do it all here, but I would encourage you to maybe watch that back on YouTube if this is something that you would be wanting to look at. We're going to be important that supervision is a two-way process. You can't have a great supervisor and someone who's not engaging in supervision. It's not going to work. You know, supervision is a two-way process. And this is taken from, I don't know ever how to pronounce this person's name, but it begins with a P. So I thought I'd use that to draw on partnership. This is about relationships-based supervision and the 8 characteristics that define relationship-based supervision. So you need to think about those 8 and whether you have those in your supervisory relationship with students. Also need to think about praxis, which is a word that a lot of people don't really use in practice, I suppose, if you like. But praxis is about the bringing together of theory, research, reflection, and practice. And what you've got there is maybe taking us back to the golden thread, but sometimes theory and reflection drop off our professional agenda as we go through. And I know students say that they hear practitioners say to them, oh, I don't use theory once I'm qualified. And that really is not helpful in terms of thinking about praxis. So in many ways, praxis is about the complexity of social work. I love the phrase, goes right back to 1944. Lindemann said that praxis is education for use. It's when we educate someone that they can then use. It's practical learning. And that's what we do as practice educators. So that's praxis. We need to keep praxis in supervision. And another P is prompt cards. I use these a lot in supervision in lots of different ways. You can make your own prompt cards, but I know a lot of practice educators in the teaching partnership have access to these as part of their toolkit. And I know a lot of practice educators are saying, I don't know how to use these now in this remote world. The easiest way is if you've got a set, a lot of students have a set, so you can ask them if they've got a set. If they haven't got a set, at the moment, all students have free access to Social Work Connect, and that gives them all of this content. So if you're using the cards, you could say to the student, can you go into the theory library on Connect and look at these theories, because it's the same as the cards. So you can still use the cards, you just need to adapt it slightly when you're not both physically in the same room picking them up. But the P that I want to use the last part of the session for is thinking about questions. In the first webinar, I said that a skilled practice educator asks more questions and that it's all about the questioning. And I think that goes for all supervisory relationships. Good supervision poses questions that prompt learning or that probe the person's thinking. So they're the P's. And I've put something together around GEMS questions. You'll be familiar with this if you've ever done anything on solution focused practice, but GEMS stand for goal setting questions, exception finding questions, miracle questions, scaling questions. For me, these are really helpful questions to think about in supervision. So think about, to what extent are you using goal setting questions with the student in supervision? I've put some examples of each form of question on the slides there, so I'm not going to read them all out for you because you can look at some of those questions. And again, as Zoe said, you'll be sent the slides, so you'll have that resource to look at in terms of, but I felt like it was something people often ask me, what kinds of questions? So I put some questions together. But you could take some time to reflect on what kinds of questions are you asking in supervision. Are you asking a range of different questions, or are you simply asking information-based questions? Because if you're just asking questions that gather information from the student, have you done this? When are you doing that by? Are you meeting that timescale? That's not going to provide everything that the student needs. They're very questions that focus on the managerial function of supervision. So look at goal setting, look at exception finding questions. I find these particularly helpful with students when they feel like, I can't do this, I don't know how to do this. Then, well, have you ever been able to do it? When have you felt confident about going out? When have you? So that you can ask questions that help the person to see that they've got the resources to deal with the difficulties themselves. That's helpful with students. What about miracle questions that help people to envisage answers? You know, the classic ones are, if you had a magic wand, what would you do? But I love questions like, imagine if you could go 20 years into the future, what do you want that child to remember about social work involvement in their life? How do you want that person to feel about your connection with them in 10 years' time? Those sorts of, if you could go back in time, if you could go forwards in time, I love those as miracle questions, and they really probe thinking. And then scaling questions. I think we're very good at using scaling questions. So you might say, on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is not at all confident, 5 is very confident, how confident do you feel about this piece of work? But the key is that you need to always follow a scale with a tail. Otherwise, it's not a scaling question. So if I say to a student, on a scale of 1 to 5, how confident do you feel about that? If they say, I'm a 2, my tail would be, what would it take to move you to a 3 or 4? So that helps them to move up or down the scale, whatever the scale is, however you're using the scale. One thing I'd say is, I think a lot of people use a scale of 1 to 10, and for me that's too much. It's too big and you can't get people to see movement within that. I would usually use a 1 to 5, but you could form your scale however you want to, as long as it has a tail. So they're your GEMS questions, examples of GEMS questions. Other types of questions, you could ask awareness raising questions in supervision. You could ask expansive questions in supervision. You could ask clarifying questions. You could ask tailed questions. All of these, when you model the model, what you're doing is you're asking a variety of questions to the student. You're enabling the student to recognize that in assessment, we should be asking a variety of questions of service users. So question variety is really important. But what I think can be really helpful, as a practice educator is what's called Socratic questions, Socratic questioning. I know that Gurnam Singh, who I really admire, and he does a lot of work in the teaching partnership, he talks a lot about Socratic questioning. And it goes back to philosophy, so there's another P there. But Socrates based his philosophy by engaging participants in a series of questions that tested assumptions, extended their thinking, linking questions, following up questions, linking it to that, linking it to that. It's that constant questioning that probes thinking, and that's, I think, what we should be looking to work towards as practice educators. I don't think I'm always very good at that. That's, you know, my own reflection. So I think that's really important. I could see somebody raised their hand at this point. I'm almost finished, and then I'm going to leave 5 minutes at the end for questions. So hopefully we can come back to that. The final couple of P's are problem solving. Good reflective supervision helps people find their own solutions to the problems. And Waskett talks a lot about solution-focused supervision, and I've put something down there about what solution-focused supervision is. It takes a not knowing approach. And I think that's, a lot of practice educators find that hard, especially new practice educators. If you're being assessed, you feel like you should know the answer to the questions the students asked you, so you always feel like I must do that. So we need to take a more of a not knowing approach. I don't know the answer, and help the person to find the answer. I think that's really important. Otherwise, all we do is we equip people to go forwards to think, I just go to my supervisor and ask them what to do and they will tell me. And that should never be how supervision is used. So problem solving, help people to problem solve for themselves in supervision. And then the final thing is this. To me, this is about a concluding reflection. It's about promoting continued reflection, but the P for me in this is it helps to pinpoint progress. At the end of every supervision session, Jane knows that I do this, and I do it at the end of every supervision session. And I'll do the any other business, when are we seeing each other again? Sometimes I find supervision kind of peters out a little bit. If you use that P, it's sort of like it kind of fizzles out. So I still do any other business, when are we seeing each other again? But then I say, let's go into our concluding reflections, and I use these 4 things: surprises, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, learning. Almost as a word association game, the student tells me their response at that point of their placement, what's surprising them, what's satisfying them, and so on. And then when I come to write the final report, I look back at all of those things. And it helps you to pinpoint progress, because what a student finds a surprise at the beginning, they're not surprised by a few weeks later, and by the end they've forgotten they were even surprised by that at the start. So it helps to pinpoint progress. And my very final P is present. I think the best gift that we can ever give to a student as a practice educator is the ability to be reflective. To enable that in supervision is really important. Reflection is so important for ourselves and our practice, and so it's the present. But I suppose in many ways it's also, if you want to have a play on that, it's about our presence. It's about us feeling we are there for that student in that moment at that time. We are present for them, and that's the most important thing that I think we can give to students. So there's loads of P's that we've gone through. I said to you at the beginning, how many P's do you think? And Zoe will tell us if there's a number of P's, I think probably that you've got that I don't. I haven't gone through in the presentation. But there's all the P's that I came up with at the beginning when I was thinking through. And then I picked out of those which ones was I going to talk about in the presentation. So if you like, rather than the 4 F's or the 10 C's, what I got was 105 P's of supervision. So there were a lot of P's. Clearly couldn't cover all of them, but that's where I wanted to conclude the presentation. I'm hoping we've got a few, we don't have many minutes, I know. I'm hoping we've got a few minutes left for any questions and comments and so on, but we will, as I said at the beginning, we will collate questions and come back to you if there's anything in the chat that we've not been able to cover. But at this point, Zoe, is there anything that you would want to add? There are the references for the material I've shared on screen now.
Frantically scribbling to write down some P's, so it was nice to see that there were positive P's, and some of the scarier ones, you know, panic came up, you know, persistence, power was there. Helen Franklin put, and I can never pronounce this, is it panacea? I don't know where that came from. I'm quite interested in that one. So maybe me and you can have a chat about that, Helen. There's been a couple of comments and things made. So somebody made comment to the fact that the pedagogy piece sounds like the Johari window method. Someone said that they're having both mixed face-to-face and virtual sessions. So that's kind of another element to that. And one of the questions that's sitting in the question and answer from Denise is, I tend to refer to Dole's ESMA model, so would be interested to know where Siobhan feels the assessment element of working with students fits into supervision, if it does. So I feel like that's been sat there quite a long time. So if we can answer that one, I think Denise would appreciate that.
Okay, I think that in many ways is quite a tricky one to answer in just a few minutes, but I suppose what I'd say is we are, whether it's consciously, whether it's being discussed with the student, we are assessing them all of the time in all of our contact with the student. So I think we're assessing what the student shares in supervision, how the student shares those things in supervision. But I also think that we have very specific agenda aspects that are about the assessment within supervision. So there'll be times where I will talk to the student about, let's have a conversation about this particular PCF domain in our next session. I'd like you to prepare for that, or let's have a conversation about this. And I think when we're providing feedback to students, for example, I put feedback onto my supervision agenda every session, and I'll provide the student with feedback and I'll ask them for feedback. So I'm always looking at feedback and the feedback loop, and that's also a part of assessment. So I suppose for me, it's maybe less formal, but I think the assessment does come into supervision in lots of different ways. I've tried to give a couple of examples there, but maybe what I would say is that's something we'll cover more in the third and final webinar, which is all about assessment. So we'll look at where assessment takes place and how assessment takes place, and some elements of that will be about supervision. But I suppose what I would say on reflection as a final point is, because the programme that Jane and her colleague students are on, they changed their requirements because of the pandemic and brought the number of observations down to just one observation. They brought down the number of days on placement. And so I suppose I feel on reflection that I've actually used supervision more as an assessment method in itself than I perhaps ordinarily would, because I'm looking at how does the student present in supervision, what are they bringing, perhaps because I haven't been able to do as many direct observations as normal, or so maybe that's been an aspect, I think, for me.